Okay, so now I've got you back for the second half of the notes. And in these notes, we're going to talk about some different things. We've already talked about conditional statements in the previous part. That uses a hypothesis and a conclusion, uses if and then. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be given a conditional statement, and we're going to have to give the converse, inverse, and contrapositive. So I'm going to go through each part, or each different type of statement, and explain how to write them. And then we'll talk about truth to these statements and how to evaluate truth values. So the converse of a statement exchanges the hypothesis and the conclusion. It swaps the if and then statements. The inverse does something called negating. It negates the hypothesis and the conclusion. So negating a statement is basically putting not in front of that statement. So the negation to the statement, it is raining outside, is it is not raining outside. The negation to I don't have a lawnmower is I do have a lawnmower. So negating either takes away the word not or adds the word not to a statement. And then a contrapositive is a combination of the converse and the inverse. It switches the hypothesis and conclusion, and it negates both. So the converse swaps hypothesis and conclusion. Inverse negates them. Contrapositive does both. So we're going to get some practice doing this, writing statements, conditional statements, and then writing their converse, inverse, and contrapositive. So in our next example, we are going to write the conditional to the statement, angle A measures 98 degrees, so angle A is obtuse. So to remember, conditional statements are that if P, then Q form. So P is an angle A measures 98 degrees. Q is A is obtuse. So my if-then statement is, if angle A measures 98 degrees, then angle A is obtuse. The converse of that statement has us write the hypothesis and the conclusion in reverse. So the converse tells us if angle A is obtuse, then angle A measures 98 degrees, but measures 98. So the converse just takes P and Q, swaps them. The inverse does not swap P and Q, it just negates them. So the inverse would say if angle A doesn't measure 98, then angle A isn't obtuse. Okay? Then it isn't obtuse. So don't worry about the truth value of these. We'll talk about that in a second. Then the contrapositive, you swap and negate the hypothesis and conclusion. So I'd say if not Q, then not P. So the contrapositive would be if angle A isn't obtuse, then angle A doesn't measure 98 degrees or doesn't measure 98. So I'm going to change my color, and I'm going to quick go through the truth value of each of these statements. We talked about the definition of obtuse angles. Obtuse angles are angles that measure between 90 and 180 degrees, okay? So those are obtuse angles. So the conditional statement, if an angle is 98 degrees, then it is obtuse. That conditional statement, this is true. So I'm going to put T, or write true at the end of it. That's a true statement. The converse, if angle A is obtuse, then it measures 98. That's true for only 98 degrees. But there are other angles that are obtuse that aren't 98 degrees. So the converse is false. It's not true for all obtuse angles that they're all 98 degrees. If we look at the inverse, if an angle doesn't measure 98 degrees, then it isn't obtuse. That's also false. There are angles that don't measure 98 degrees, but are obtuse. So those are both false. Now, contrapositive, if angle A isn't obtuse, then it doesn't measure 98 degrees. Well, if the angle isn't obtuse, it's got to be acute, it's got to be right, or it's got to be straight. So it can't measure 98 degrees if it isn't obtuse. So that is true. So the thing I want us to understand is that converse and inverse always are either both true or both false. They are called equivalent statements. They always have the same truth value. The original statement, the conditional and the contrapositive, always have the same truth statement. They're either both true or both false. So we've got one more example. And this example talks about finding the truth, writing and finding the truth values. Now you're only going to have to write half the statement, so that kind of cuts down your writing a little bit. But it asks, what is the converse, inverse, and contrapositive of the conditional statement below, and what are the truth values of each? If a statement is false, give a counterexample. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read out, if a vegetable is a carrot, then it contains beta-carotene. The converse of that makes it contains beta-carotene the hypothesis. So this is kind of weird how it's written, the then here. I'm just going to write, then it is a carrot. Okay, then it is a carrot. The inverse doesn't swap, it just negates. It says if a vegetable is not a carrot, then it doesn't contain beta-carotene. Beta-carotene is a nutrient. I'm pretty sure that's the nutrient in carrots that helps your eyesight when people talk about carrots being good for your eyes. And then the last one, swaps and negates. So it says if a vegetable does not contain beta-carotene, then it is not a carrot. Okay? So I will kind of help you. You don't have to know a lot about carrots so we can evaluate this. But the converse of the statement, that converse is false. Okay? That converse is false. Because if a vegetable does contain beta-carotene, it doesn't have to be a carrot. There are other vegetables that contain beta-carotene. So the inverse, that means the inverse is also false. Because if it's not a carrot, it could still contain beta-carotene. So just remembering converse and inverse are either both true or both false. The conditional statement is true. If a vegetable is a carrot, then it contains a beta-carotene. If the vegetable does not contain beta-carotene, then it is not a carrot, because carrots contain that nutrient. So the contrapositive is true. So just remembering, conditional and contrapositive, both true or both false. Converse and inverse, both true or both false. So our counterexample or counterexamples for these, you don't need to know this, but you got to think of a different vegetable that contains beta-carotene. I think most vegetables contain it. Carrots just have more of it. So an example of a vegetable that contains beta-carotene that's not a carrot would be sweet potato. And I think it has something to do with them being orange. I'm not sure about that, but you can fact check me on that statement. But just evaluating statements and seeing if it's true for all cases of that statement. So now you have enough to go off of to do the rest of the practice and then take the checkpoint.